Hey everyone, and welcome to your Midterm 2 review. Just a reminder about these reviews as well that the content that I go over isn't inclusive of all the content that you need to know. It's just a way for you to see how a lot of the concepts are tied in. Again, we review a lot of this content in individualized, compartmentalized topics. For example, nervous system, cardiovascular system, endocrine, etc. They're all separate. However, the way it truly works within our biological systems is they're all synergistic, right? So, again, this kind of word or concept idea map is hopefully one going to tie in a lot of ideas together that we've covered throughout this unit, but also I hope it's a demonstration of ways that you can go through the material on your own, trying to tie in material between different chapters as well, largely because this is going to be one of the main ways that you can integrate and remember a lot of the content a lot better yourselves, but you'll also understand how these systems work together at large. So moving forward into the review, again, I want you to just keep that in mind that it's not totally inclusive of content. We do cover some major ideas, and I hope you take away a little bit of integration of the content as well. Okay, so if we're going to start off with one place, I typically like to start off with the central nervous system. So if we start off with our CNS, that's our brain and our spinal cord. And of course, we know our brain, as soon as we start thinking about exercise, starts queuing up this preparedness or readiness for exercise in our bodies, right? So that will send out a signal to our peripheral nervous system. So the other parts of our body outside of the central nervous system. Now, our peripheral nervous system sends back sensory, and we typically get motor signals out of our central nervous system. However, it can also stimulate other things through our peripheral nervous system. Of such, we have our autonomic nervous system, which gives us control of things that we're not necessarily conscious of, but we can also have conscious control of things through our somatic nervous system. Okay, so this one is voluntary, this one is non-voluntary. Okay, our autonomic system. But it's through this autonomic system that we get this preparedness for our body occurring, and that's typically through signals to our endocrine system initially and our cardiovascular system. So to our endocrine system, what we get is some signals through our hypothalamus to our pituitary. So remember, our hypothalamus is kind of like the control relay center, and it will send releasing hormones to the pituitary. And the pituitary gland, both anterior, posterior, is our master gland. And that will then send out more hormones to other parts of the body. Okay. So, so we have our pituitary, which will say, in this particular case, when we're speaking about exercise, is we actually have two more divisions of our autonomic nervous system. There is we have our parasympathetic nervous system, and our sympathetic nervous system as well. Okay, so let's maybe we'll change the names. We'll call this para-symp and symp. Okay, so with our sympathetic nervous system, this one is the fight or flight, right? So if we need to flee from danger, get ready for sport or exercise or whatever it is, anything we would need to do physically, or if we're just mentally stressed, this part of our nervous system gets queued up, right? So again, we kind of get that signal, preparatory signal to our hypothalamus, which will then start our endocrine signaling from the hypothalamus to the pituitary down to our, let's try to stay the same color, adrenal glands. Okay, and of course we get signals to our adrenal glands through a couple of different means. So we get our ACTH, we have corticosteroids stimulating our adrenal glands. From there we get cortisol, which is a glucocorticosteroid. Excuse me. We get epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are some of our adrenal hormones as well. Okay. And yeah, also I guess we get we get corticosteroids as well. Okay, from our adrenal cortex. Great. So from these, essentially we start getting the body ready for exercise. So a couple of different things will also happen with our cardiovascular system. So what we'll see is we can get a signal directly to our heart, which will increase heart rate, but primarily it's these hormones that will start increasing our heart rate as well. And so what we see is our heart rate increase. Okay. Now, as we get exercising, so this is all kind of in preparation, literally just thinking about exercise, all of these systems get recruited, right? But if we start exercising, so let's say we're continuing on now into exercise. I was kind of prepped. We'll get a continued activation of our sympathetic nervous system, a continued reinforcement of this kind of hormonal response to exercise, which will continue our cardiovascular response as well. And one of the main reasons for this is we want to see a increase in our cardiac output. So how much blood can we get flowing through our body? And that is our heart rate times our stroke volume. Okay. Now there's a few things obviously that go in this. We've already discussed a few ways that our heart rate increases, again through hormonal and nervous stimulation. But our stroke volume inherently has some adaptations that can help it increase as well, right? And primarily when we're talking about that, we really mean our Frank-Starling equation. So our end diastolic volume and systolic volume goes up in particular, right? So end systolic volume increases. And if we can recall back to the difference between diastolic and systolic, our systolic is when our ventricles fill. Now the ventricles are the two largest parts of the heart, right? The two out of the four chambers that are the largest, because they have to pump blood the farthest away from the heart. Our atrials, they essentially pump just to the ventricles, which are the neighboring chambers of the heart, so they don't need very much musculature. Okay, so now as we kind of turn to our cardiovascular side of things, again, heart rate goes up, stroke volume goes up, but there's something also important going on both with our vasculature and our blood itself, right? That allows us to exercise. And again, I'm going to focus a bit more on endurance-based exercise or prolonged exercise. We'll speak briefly about resistance training and how that all fits in near the end. So, so again, to keep cardiac output up, the main goal of all of this, as always, is oxygen, okay? And what sort of volume of oxygen can we get delivered to our working muscles so that we can sustain activity? That's one of the main goals of all of these cardiovascular adaptations and physiological responses to exercise. Okay, so let's tie in one of the first cardiovascular responses, and that's a shifting of blood, okay, or a shunting of blood in some areas and rediverting to others. So again, as we start increasing exercise and we start getting endocrine signals to throughout our body that we're going to be exercising. If you recall, in our capillary beds, essentially at the start, on the arterial side, side, as blood is going through in that direction. Sorry, that's getting real messy. I'm going to change colors for you. So we get oxygenated blood going through our atrials before it becomes deoxygenated and then, let's say, returns back towards the heart. So on this side, we have little sphincters that will close and shunt blood selectively to certain organs, right? So when we're exercising, what we end up seeing is an increase of blood flow to our muscles, skeletal muscle, and also our brain, relatively speaking. Now, the whole cardiac output, so the total volume of blood that actually gets pumped around our body, increases across the board, but we put a higher proportion to where we need it, and we shunt it away from organs such as our digestive system. Okay, so that's one cardio or vascular response anyway that we have to exercise, and that will be in millimeters of mercury. And then on the left side, what we have is our percentage of O2 saturation, and that's on our red blood cells, or our oxyhemoglobin. Okay. And so what we can do is we landmark a few really important numbers here in particular. So as we come across the partial pressure of O2, we can see that 40% is going to be an important number. 100% or 100 millimeters of mercury is important. On the saturation side, about 75 is there. I guess we could probably put in 40. It's a little, just to give a little landmarks. 0, and then up here is 100%. Okay. Let's do 20 as well. All right. So what we can do from this is we can understand a few really important parts. The first one being the 75 mark along there. Okay. So what we end up seeing up here is how much O2 is delivered to tissues. Well, let's even just say O2 at tissues. Okay. So what this is saying is this is at rest. So about 25% of oxygen carried by our red blood cells get unloaded at the tissues. That's more or less what that is saying. And so we can also look here at the partial pressure of our veins. So again, where oxygen gets unloaded, we can see that it's got a lower partial pressure and therefore a lower amount of saturation of our red blood cells. If we look at 100, roughly, again at rest, 100% saturation of our red blood cells, we can see that that lines up to our arterial blood. Okay. And so again, this is at rest under normal temperature conditions, all of that sort of stuff going on. Okay. What will happen though, once we start exercising and utilizing more oxygen at the tissue end of things, is we get what's called a shift to the right in this curve. And so what ends up happening there is, because so much more of our tissues are taking up oxygen, we see that because of the shift, whether it's temperature causing the shift, the increase in pH or decrease in pH, increase of acidity, or an increase of 2,3-DPG, which is again that molecule from anaerobic respiration or a mediator within glycolysis. We get that shift to the right. So because of that, what will end up happening is we get closer to, we get a lot less partial pressure here. So we essentially see that we end up getting about 10%, 10% of oxygen remaining on red blood cells as it's passing the tissue. So another way of saying that is our working tissues pull about 90% of oxygen off of our red blood cells. And so again, that shift, because we're talking about a lower partial pressure of oxygen at the tissues, we can see that a lot more. So let's just go like that. So a lot more of our oxygen gets unloaded between our arteries and our veins. And so again, that's about 90% gets unloaded. Okay, and that rightward shift helps explain that. Okay, now our atrial venous oxygen difference, or AVO2 diff. And that can, when we take that term and multiply it by our cardiac output, which again was stroke rate or stroke volume times heart rate, that will equal the total amount of volume of oxygen used by our bodies. Okay. Yeah, good. So one of the other parts mentioned while we were exercising is we had a few things such as that I mentioned that affect the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Was an increase in hydrogen protons or a decrease in pH. It's the same thing. We had more 2,3-DPG, which is a molecule from our anaerobic respiration. And we're talking about temperature as well. But I think the other important thing to remember through all of this as we become more metabolically active is we also see an increase in CO2. Okay, and so I think a couple of really important parts to look at is this increase in blood acidity, or increase in blood protons, or decrease or becoming more acidic. So the pH is decreasing. Okay, that's another way of saying an increase in hydrogen protons. Okay, so and our CO2, because these two in particular, our increase in CO2 actually sends a signal. This is both at rest and exercise to our central nervous system. So it'll be our pons and our medulla oblongata. So pons, medulla oblong. Okay. And so those two parts of our central nervous system really drive and control respiration. Now we can consciously think of breathing, and that's our somatic nervous system, where we can take voluntary control of our respiration. But normally it's done without conscious thought. So that is within our peripheral nervous system, in particular our autonomic nervous system. Okay. And so again, the reason why I wanted to draw focus on carbon dioxide is when that increases in blood. And again, we have our bicarbonate buffer system to help keep levels reasonable and within check. But as acidity increases with exercise, and as does our concentration of carbon dioxide in blood, those two things significantly drive and increase our ventilation. Okay. So it'll do both as far as frequency, right, and volume as well, or depth of breathing. Okay, right. And so those should be multiplied. So that'll be our total ventilatory expiration, right? Right. Okay. And that's really important because, again, that gas exchange that happens at the alveoli, because the cells are only 2 cells thick, one side from the capillary and one side from the alveoli, that gas exchange between oxygen and CO2 happen quite readily, right? Just through that two cell kind of membrane. So it diffuses really, really quick and easily. So there's very little resistance. And the larger the difference of O2, the easier it gets loaded up. The more concentration of CO2 in the blood, the easier it gets expelled. Okay, and that's really the main driver and cause of our respiration, right? Oxygen tends to play a part, but a smaller part. And just as a reminder to tie in the nervous system, we have our sensory neurons that pick this up within our arterial blood and a few other parts in the body. Okay. And yeah, I think predominantly, when we get to speaking about more, so that was a more immediate kind of response to exercise and some of the physiology that occurs during it immediately. But if we were to turn and just for a moment take a look at more of the long-term changes that we see from exercise, is for cardiovascular adaptations. What we really tend to see is a lot of cardiovascular side. So we see an increase in left ventricle size, which just generally, I would say, increases our cardiac output overall. So what we can do is essentially increase the amount of volume of oxygen that we can handle. So our peak increases. At rest, our heart rate drops down significantly, and that's because our stroke volume, generally speaking, has increased, and that's partly related to that. And both these factors, of course, are related to this. And we also get changes in the blood, right? So our blood increases in red blood cell content. Right, now notice I didn't really say much about adaptations of the lungs. The lungs themselves don't physically adapt to training. We did speak about how some muscular, like secondary respiratory muscles can increase. And again, the diaphragm can become fatigued above about 85% of VO2 max workload. We can train them to our accessory muscles to pick up the slack for the diaphragm at that point in time, but typically that's pretty minimal. And again, our endocrine system tends to respond and help our body recover from bouts of exercise. Aside from maybe generally decreased cortisol levels, so lower stress levels for people who train quite a bit cardiovascularly. I would say most of the adaptations we see tend to be cardiovascular and cardiovascular in nature. With our strength trained individuals, we'll see that their heart can maintain its cardiac output given the intra-abdominal and pleural, so the body cavities pressure as we strength train. But aside from that, there's not too many other adaptations that are quite significant as far as our cardiovascular system goes, specific to any major changes that way. Okay, and that's it for the review. Hopefully you took something away from there. Hopefully you can see one way you can start tying all the concepts from the 4 different systems that we learned together. And yeah, good luck and happy studies.